Hello, I'm Dustin Isom, and today I'm presenting Botanic Attire and specifically the work I completed around validating the feasibility and viability of the business through structured supplier discovery and market testing. In previous sprints, I focused heavily on customer discovery, page optimization, and validating market interest. This sprint shifted into one of the most critical phases for a physical product business, which is determining whether the product can actually be operationally and financially viable before committing meaningful capital. The goal was to reduce uncertainty around manufacturing, which was really my biggest risky assumptions, and then supplier scalability, MOQs, unit economics, packaging, and profitability. I approach this similarly to how I would approach a strategic sourcing initiative in my professional procurement career, using structured RFPs and supplier analysis to validate the business model. So I'm going to show you my risky assumption template, which I will be attaching to my submission for this assessment. But I tested so many risky assumptions through this RFP because I just wanted to capture as much information as I possibly could from vendors because really this was the space that I just didn't know um, was feasible or viable. So I'll show you that real quick and then I will scoot back over to the presentation and we'll jump into that. So I'm going to focus on a subset of these risky assumptions because I have so many. So I'm going to focus on some of the most important ones in the presentation, which we'll get back to and we'll work through kind of my decision-making process from there. So here is my experiment loop map with my risky assumptions, the experiments I tested, the expected result, the duration, actual results, and then my decision. Some of these I didn't actually get through yet because there's just things that I have to get through first before I can get to like testing a physical product and actually having a pilot run of these. And so anyway, as you can see, I have a ton in here, which we'll talk a lot about. I will be attaching it so you can see the full list, but there's a lot of things I wanted to test through this RFP, and I structured a professional RFP package to capture as much information as possible. So we'll talk a lot about that in the presentation too. So let's pull the presentation back up and we will get started. So one thing I noticed during customer discovery is that indoor plants have evolved beyond just being plants. They've become a part of people's home identity and decor style. The issue is that most plants are sold in unattractive black or brown nursery pots. So if you think about Home Depot, Walmart, those stores, they always typically just sell it in a plain pot. And those usually class with modern interiors. And consumers want a nicer look, but upgrading requires repotting, which is expensive, messy, intimidating for casual plant owners. Another major insight was that people frequently decorate seasonally, personalize gifts, or redesign spaces, but there's no simple or affordable way to refresh the appearance of a plant pot without completely replacing it. That's where I saw an opportunity to create something simple, decorative, customizable, and low commitment. So my product, Botanic Attire, solves this problem through decorative shrink fit plant skirts that wrap around standard nursery pots, and shrink into place using a household hairdryer. The customer doesn't need to repot anything. They simply apply the sleeve around the existing pot, heat it, and the material conforms tightly around the container, creating a premium decorative appearance. What makes this exciting is the flexibility. The product supports seasonal designs, branded experiences, personalized gifting, and home decor trends, all without changing the actual plant or pot. This creates a very low friction customer experience while also opening multiple future revenue streams, which we'll talk a little bit about in the following slides. So this sprint focus, like I said before, specifically on my highest risk assumptions. For physical product startups, feasibility and viability are often the biggest reasons businesses fail, and usually fail early. So you can have a ton of customer interest, but if the economics of the operations don't work, the business collapses before launch. And that's something I really, really wanted to avoid, and something the program taught me. So on the feasibility side, I needed to validate whether the product could consistently function from a manufacturing standpoint. Could suppliers actually produce this? Would the shrink material work correctly with household heat? Could the product scale operationally? And then on the viability side, I needed answers around production costs, MOQs, packaging, shipping, economics, and whole, and whether the margins supported a sustainable business. Without validating these assumptions first, it would have been irresponsible to continue investing in the concept. So instead of casually requesting quotes, like I said before, I built a formal RFP process similar to what I use professionally in strategic sourcing. I'm actually a director at Marriott and source for a living. So I took that and flipped that into this business entrepreneurship. And I intentionally designed the RFP to function as a validation instrument. So every section of the RFP was tied directly to risky assumptions I needed answers to. I sent the RFP to multiple manufacturers, eventually followed up with like 8 more digital because I was learning pretty quickly that I needed a digital printing supplier. Um, and I requested information around pricing, MOQs, lead time, material compatibility, printing methods, packaging, and scalability. Then I compared supplier responses side by side to identify patterns and reduce uncertainty. What was powerful about this process is that one structured exercise allowed me to simultaneously validate multiple operational assumptions, some of my most risky assumptions, which was really cool to do and finally get to the results of. So this slide summarizes the 5 most important assumptions I tested through supplier engagement. Obviously, I showed you before that there were a lot of risky assumptions. Some of them kind of butted off of one another. But there were keys to those, right, that were really leading me into my decision-making process. And the first was manufacturing cost. I really needed to know whether the product could be produced cheaply enough to support healthy retail margins. And the supplier bids came back around 57 cents per unit, which validated that the economics were much stronger than originally expected, which was really cool. Second was MOQ feasibility. As an early stage founder, committing to massive inventory orders would create major risk. So I wanted to make sure I could avoid that. Multiple vendors confirmed they could support smaller pilot quantities. Third was technical feasibility. Suppliers confirmed the shrink material would work with household heat application, which validated the core customer experience, the DIY stuff. Fourth was packaging and shipping. Because the product is lightweight and compact, shipping economics remain highly favorable for e-commerce. And finally, digital printing became a major discovery, like I said, because it eliminates expensive tooling and enables rapid seasonal design launches, which is a big piece of my concept. So what I learned from vendors, one of the biggest learnings was that the supply chain landscape was actually more favorable than I originally expected. I found multiple suppliers capable of supporting the business, which reduced supplier concentration risk significantly. Digital printing was especially important because it changes the economics of the business. Instead of investing heavily into tooling and large production commitments, I can iterate designs quickly and test collections with lower risk. I also learned that many suppliers are surprisingly willing to collaborate with early stage founders when the opportunity is positioned professionally. I learned the hard way in the beginning, but once I switched that up, I had a much bigger response rate. Lead times were shorter than expected, and packaging complexity was much simpler than originally assumed. So overall, the supplier engagement significantly reduced operational uncertainty, which was my biggest goal. And this slide is more like a deeper dive into the unit economics and viability. It represents one of the most important moments in the validation process because it ties together feasibility and profitability. The estimated COGS came in around 57 cents per unit, while my projected retail pricing is approximately 19.99, which is a big difference. The CAC came in right around 8.89, which is pretty encouraging relative to projected retail pricing. So with those two numbers, it creates a very strong margin potential, even after accounting for the rest of the costs, fulfillment, packaging, operational expenses, things like that. I also built a bundle strategy around 3-pack and 5-pack offerings because the incremental production cost remains low while increasing average order value significantly. Um, and another important metric was the CAC, which I already spoke about, which was from the Meta advertising experiences I did before. So based on that early testing, estimated customer acquisition came just below $9. So when I combined these numbers into the economics calculator, it gave me confidence that the business model could realistically support scaling, and I was in the green. So I wanted to explain the customer validation that I had just because it's important to understand the desirability. If especially if you weren't grading my previous work. So while this sprint focused primarily on feasibility and viability, I also continued validating customer interest through meta advertising experiments. I spent approximately $160 across targeted campaigns and generated around 60 buy now clicks from highly targeted audiences. The strongest engagement came from women between the ages of 30 and 60 who aligned more closely with home decor consumers than traditional plant hobbyists. One major insight was that positioning mattered significantly. Consumers responded strongest when the product was framed as an affordable decor transformation rather than simply a plant accessory. And seasonal personalization and custom design messaging also drove stronger engagement levels. Although purchasing was not yet enabled, the campaign successfully validated curiosity, intent, and emotional resonance with the concept. I also had a like a fake door with a buy now button, and I measured the actual buy now clicks, showing true intent to purchase. So this is my business model snapshot. It summarizes the business model that emerged from the validation process. The business is intentionally structured to remain lean and capital efficient. The combination of low production costs and direct consumer distribution creates favorable margin opportunities early. The seasonal nature of the product is also strategically important because it creates natural opportunities for repeat purchases during holidays, gifting periods, and design refresh cycles. And then beyond direct to consumer, there is also a strong B2B expansion path through branded plant skirts for hospitality groups, retailers, events, and corporate gifting or corporate headquarters, whatever really could use a brand or logo. This really does create some white space, which is exciting. But what excites me most is that the business has both emotional consumer appeal and scalable operational economics. There's a lot of other thoughts that are going into it, like partnering with artists to put their artwork on it so we can capture some of their customer group. Definitely going into retail, in Home Depot and Walmarts and in these stores and home garden centers, next to pots or plants that are sold with a pot. Lots of really good opportunity, which I'm excited about. So, how the validation changed my strategy. One of the biggest outcomes of this sprint is that validation directly reshaped my go to market strategy. Originally, I considered more traditional manufacturing approaches, but supplier conversations made it clear that digital printing provides significant flexibility with lower upfront risk and better output, better better, cleaner, crisper imagery. I also decided to prioritize direct-to-consumer launch first through Shopify and Meta rather than immediately pursuing retail partnerships. This allows me to validate demand and optimize the product before scaling. And then the advertising tests also influenced my product strategy. Seasonal and personalized designs consistently performed best, which pushed me toward leading with collection-based launches. And finally, the supplier responses reinforce the importance of starting with pilot scale production to preserve capital while continuing validation. I still have some things to validate though. All of this sounds great, right? But I think that one thing founders should always challenge themselves with is really finding, what else is there that needs to be known? What else can I tap into my niche or my customers with to continue to develop? And so, although many major risks were reduced, there are still important assumptions that require validation before full launch. One of the biggest remaining areas is material durability. I still need to physically test adhesives if I'm going to use the double-sided tape. I need to test more of the shrink performance and long-term wear in real world environments. Definitely like sun damage, things like that in the product because we want it to hold and look nice, even if it is getting some sun during the day. I also need to validate repeat purchase behavior. Seasonal demand appears promising, but I need real customer purchasing data to understand reorder frequency and lifetime value, the true stuff of all of this. And then retail merchandising is another future learning area because physical presentation and display execution matter heavily in retail environments. So something I want to focus on there. And then the next phase will focus on prototype development, consumer installation testing, definitely a lot of that testing with me and my friends and family, and then expanded advertising experiments and eventually pre-order validation, which I really want to get into, just to really see what the real true intent is when they can actually know the timeline to get their product. And this is kind of why I believe this can work. At the beginning of this process, Botanica Tire was primarily an idea that I created in my head, and to see it come to life, right, and have it supported by customer interest. That's what it was. Today, many of the largest operational and financial risks have been significantly reduced through structured testing and supplier validation. I now have validated manufacturing pathways, encouraging unit economics, scalable printing methods, supplier interest, and measurable customer engagement. The biggest shift for me personally is that this no longer feels hypothetical. This business now feels operationally achievable, and that feels really good. There's still work ahead, like I said, but the validation process transformed uncertainty into actionable confidence. And just to close, this sprint fundamentally changed the maturity of the business through supplier discovery, risky assumption testing, and market validation. Botanica Tire evolved, and I evolved from an interesting concept into a business with realistic operational pathways towards launch and scale. The biggest lesson for me was understanding how structured experimentation and supplier engagement can dramatically reduce uncertainty before large financial commitments are made. Thank God. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your feedback and or questions.